Russia and Ukraine are engaged in a tense contest. For far too long now, more than 100,000 Russian troops are amassed along the Russia Ukraine border, and for the first time in several decades, the threat of a war is real. There are chances that Russia might invade Ukraine any day now, according to the United States. But why are Russia and Ukraine engaged in such a bitter contest? What exactly is happening along the Russia Ukraine border? What is the history behind it? What is the politics behind it? In this video, I'll try and decode both these points. Okay, in this video, I'll try and answer both these questions. So let's get started. First of all, in order to understand what's happening along the Russia Ukraine border, we need to get back into history because more often than not, conflicts in the present have their answers in the past. When it comes to Ukraine, Russia never considered Ukraine as an independent sovereign country. Theoretically, that is, on paper, Ukraine might be an independent country, a country that gained independence in 1991. Yes, Ukraine is a very recent, newly independent country, right? It's been just more than 30 years since its independence. But for Russia, Ukraine was never an independent country, and therefore, the very fact that it is now independent, that is a thorn in Russia's politics. So let's get back to history for a bit. Now, for the larger part of Ukraine's history, it has been a part of Russia, right? You go back to the days of the Russian Empire, the rule of the Tsars in Russia, and you would find that Ukraine, Belarus, and several other East European countries, which are today independent nations in their own right, they once constituted a larger part of the Russian Empire. Most of these countries were with Russia till the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Ukraine too was, remember, a part of the Soviet Union until it decided to break away from the Soviet Union in December 1991. It held a referendum, and the very fact that Ukraine was leaving the Soviet Union left Russia with no choice but to allow the collapse of the Union. Now, as I said, Ukraine, for the larger part of its history, has been a part of Russia. And in 1917, that is when the Russian Revolution took place, when the Bolsheviks came to power in Russia, Ukraine broke away from the Soviet Union. For 2 long years, it stayed independent, and those 2 years sowed the seeds of separatism, sowed the seeds of independent identity, and sowed the seeds of a separate Ukrainian state in the minds of the Ukrainians. In 1920, the Bolsheviks regained control over large parts of Ukraine and formally, integrated it into Russia. It was only in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that Ukraine finally became independent. Last year, Vladimir Putin wrote a letter in which he considered Ukrainians and the Russians as one people. And this is very important to understand. Theoretically, on paper, while Ukrainians and Russians might be two different people, two different ethnicities, two different cultures, two different traditions, two different people, but in the eyes of Putin, Ukrainians and Russians are the same. He blames the Western countries, basically the United States, for provoking separatism, for sowing the seeds of separatism in Ukraine. He believes that Ukrainians have been misled into believing that they are different from Russians, that they are a separate state of their own, and that they are different people and therefore they deserve a separate state on their own. Russia and Putin believes that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and the loss of Ukraine is seen by Russia as a national humiliation. This is a theme that is common among authoritarians all over the world. Whether it is in India, whether it is in China, or whether it is in Russia, you would see that there is a pattern to this, because leaders in all these countries, talk about a rich, glorious heritage in the past. Whether or not the past was glorious, rich, and as full of heritage as these people claim to be, they make their followers and supporters believe that there was a glorious past and we need to reclaim it. And therefore, for Putin, getting back Ukraine is a part of that restoration. He sees the loss of not just Ukraine, but in fact several East European countries which were once a part of the Soviet Union as a national humiliation for Russia. The very fact that Ukraine is now thinking of joining NATO and becoming a part of the US led military alliance is giving nightmares to Putin and Russia. Because as if Ukraine's independent existence was not enough, it is now thinking of joining Russia's arch enemy, that is the United States. And this is why it is so mad at Ukraine and wants to annex Ukraine anytime. And that is the reason why they are threatening America with 100,000 troops lined along the Russian-Ukrainian border, who are waiting to invade any day. And if the Americans are to be believed, then then Russia can invade Ukraine, can forcefully regain control of Ukraine anytime now. So the first thing that we needed to understand was history, and therefore there are a couple of points that I will tell you very briefly, very quickly, in order to summarize, why history is so important when it comes to decoding the current crisis between Russia and Ukraine. Number one is that for the larger part of Russia, for the Ukraine's history, for the larger part of Ukrainian history, it has been a part of Russia, whether Ukraine likes it or not. Before 1991, it was a part of Russia. As I told you in the ninth, so back in the ninth century, when the large Russian Empire ruled over many of these countries, Ukraine, along with Belarus and other East European countries, were a part of the Russian Empire. It was only in 1917, when the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia, when the Russian Revolution took place, that Ukraine broke away for a brief period. Within 2 years, that is in 1920, the Bolsheviks regained control of Ukraine and had it under its control till the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Therefore, the very fact that Ukraine has been a part of Russia for such a long period of time is enough to convince Russians and Putin that Ukrainians are basically Russians. They may be ethnically different, but they are more or less, Russians. And the fact that they have lost Ukraine despite having it for such a long time in history, is a national humiliation for them. Just as China sees the loss of, say, Taiwan or Hong Kong as national humiliation, just as India sees, say, for example, the loss of Pakistan occupied Kashmir as national humiliation, Putin also sees the loss of Ukraine as a national embarrassment, as a national humiliation. And just like leaders in India and in China talking about, restoring the old glorious days, Putin is also telling Russians that we need to restore those old glorious days of Russian Empire, when Ukraine used to be a part of us, when they were not misled by the Americans to believe that they are a different people, that they deserve a separate state of their own. So that is one, that is history that we needed to understand. The second point that we must talk about is geopolitics. Remember, no matter which war you talk about, every war that has happened in history has happened because there was something to be achieved, something to be lost, some resources that you could take control of, some resources that you could snatch away from your opponents. And this is no different. So ever since the end of the Soviet Union, that is in 1991, when Ukraine broke away, several East European countries slowly started joining the NATO, or the American-led global military alliance. Basically, NATO is a military alliance of America and its allies, and whoever joins NATO is therefore given a security guarantee by the Americans. So, say for example, if country ABC were to join NATO, then any attack on ABC by a foreign power would be considered an attack on the United States, and by virtue of NATO, the US would swing into protection of these countries A, B, and C. So, ever since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991, NATO has expanded eastwards. That is, East European countries, the likes of Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Sweden, for instance, Norway, Poland, all these countries which were once heavily under the Russian sphere of influence. Russia had a control over their politics, over their military, over their economy, first under the Russian Empire and second under the Soviet Union. But after the end of the Soviet Union, these East European countries first broke away from the Soviet Union. They became independent countries, and they joined the American-led military alliance called NATO. And Ukraine is the latest entrant to this, or is at least trying to become a part of NATO. Now, why is Ukraine trying to become a part of NATO? Simply because it needs the Americans, simply because it needs the security provided by the Americans. Ukraine knows that Russia will not wait for a long time to avenge Ukraine back. We know what happened in 2014 when there was popular protest against the then Ukrainian leader Viktor Yanukovych. We know that Russia forcefully annexed Crimea, parts of Donbass, Luhansk, and Donetsk, which are basically populated by ethnically Russian speaking people. They were provided arms and ammunition and help by the Russian army. And that is the reason how they managed to forcefully take away those parts of Ukraine. And therefore, Ukrainians know that it is only a matter of time before the Russians come back and take away their whole territory. The attack may not happen today, the attack may not happen tomorrow, but it will come someday, right? And the Russians won't wait for long. At least Putin won't wait for long. So they need security guarantees, and who better than America, to provide them a blanket of security guarantee? And that is why they want to join NATO, secure their borders, become a part of America-led global alliance, prosper economically and militarily. Russia obviously sees this as a major threat because the East Europe, which Russia once controlled, whether in terms of its economy, whether in terms of politics, it had a huge influence over these countries. But one after the other, all these countries joined NATO and came under the American sphere of influence. Today, if you look around, Russia is really, low on partners. It has only one friend in Belarus, where the last dictator of Europe, Alexander Lukashenko, is in power. And we know that there were popular protests against Lukashenko because in the recent elections, the opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she won the elections, but that was overturned by Lukashenko himself. He claimed that he had won the maximum votes, and basically just what a dictator does. He basically suppressed protests in Belarus. The Russians came to their rescue. Putin expressed support for Lukashenko. We saw similar protests in Kazakhstan, for instance, another country, another Soviet country that was once heavily under the Russian influence, but now obviously is an independent democratic country. So Russia sees the loss of its sphere of influence, as something that America is determined to undermine. It feels that it's only a matter of time before the Americans, make friends with all of Russia's previous spheres of influence. So that's one thing that concerns Putin. Also, remember, if Ukraine joins NATO, America would be firmly standing on the doors of Russia. We do know, if you look at the world map, Ukraine and Russia, share a long border. So does Belarus and Russia, but Belarus is not coming under American support or American influence anytime soon, right? Because it has the blessings of Putin. Putin has been trying to take control of Ukraine in some ways, trying to manipulate its politics, but so far he has been unsuccessful. And therefore, it fears that if Ukraine were to join NATO, US would be standing on the doors of Russia, right? And it would be a military, it would be a security scare for Russia, right? Because it sees Ukraine as a buffer between America and Russia. But once Ukraine joins NATO, America would literally be at the doors of Russia, and that would be a huge security nightmare. If you look at it from a perspective of a war, you just need to understand what would happen if a war would break out. Ukraine would be a part of NATO, and therefore by extension, an American ally, and therefore America would be able to place its arms and missiles and everything it wants along the Russian border, and it makes it so easy for America, to attack Russia in any future war. At the end of the day, no matter what happens at the global stage, it is for global supremacy, it is for winning wars of the future. And having your enemy at your doorsteps is not a very sensible move. Putin knows that, and he's therefore skeptical and very apprehensive, very scared of losing control over Ukraine because number one, history-wise, it will add to the wounds of the national humiliation, and economic and geopolitics-wise, America would come and stand on the doors of Russia, which is a huge security nightmare. Amidst all this, where does Europe fit in? Because we have seen German Chancellor Olaf Scholz make a trip to Moscow and Kiev. We saw French President Emmanuel Macron make a trip to Putin as well. So where does Europe fit into all this? And this is the most interesting part because Europe is heavily dependent on Russia for its oil and gas supplies. So in terms of meeting its energy requirements, Europe heavily depends on Russia. And that is the reason why you would see that there is some amount of hesitation, whether in Berlin or whether in Paris, in joining America forcefully, in declaring full support for the American-led alliance against Russia in this contest with Ukraine, because Europe, as long as it is dependent on Russia for its energy needs, it won't be able to declare support to the United States in the way that Biden would be expecting from Europe. And this is a calculation that Putin understands. He knows that if he can keep Europe and the US divided, he will literally win the war against Ukraine. And that is why he's so confident, Because a lot of people must be thinking that why has Putin chosen this time, to attack or to think of invading Ukraine? He could have done it a year before, he could have done it a year later, but why now? Because he knows that as of today, Europe is so dependent on Russia for meeting its energy requirements, whether it is powerful countries like Germany, France, or whether it is a Poland. They're so dependent on Russia for the energy requirements that they would never go to war against Russia on the side of the United States, at least not in the present scenario. And so all these factors, played together, and all of these factors have ensured that Russia and Ukraine are locked in a tense contest with each other. What would happen next is anyone's guess. Russia might invade Ukraine. Russia might get back Ukraine and celebrate it as a national, as a restoration of its national pride. America might rue the loss of Ukraine to Russia, which would be somewhat demoralizing for the United States, because it is the global supreme power, and losing out to Russia in this contest may not be good news for the United States, whose powers are already on the decline, and there are talks about whether US is the same old superpower that it once used to be. But we need to wait and watch. But as George Orwell said, whoever controls the past controls the present. And this is very much, the the whole total of what is at stake in Russia and Ukraine. There's history, there's geopolitics, and all these come together to make this contest an exciting one to observe from the distance. But for the people who are involved in this, for the people who are in the middle of all this is nothing less than a nightmare. A war benefits no one. Remember, it's the common people who lose their lives and loved ones, while superpowers like America and Russia, would simply walk over the dead bodies. We need to see what happens next. But this is all I have in this explainer.